Hello. Today is the third Sunday before Christmas, the second Sunday of Advent. There are two candles lit in the Advent wreath, and we're continuing reading Ishtar's Odyssey by Arnold Utrida. Today's chapter is titled Peril. Ishtar had barely closed his eyes in sleep, it seemed, before Kazim shook him awake. "Arise, young master, it is a new day." But the darkness Ishtar saw through the flap of the tent told him it was still very much night-time. Ishtar yawned and stretched. Everything from his ears to his toenails hurt from the previous day's walking, and then he almost gagged when he saw Varta approaching him with a cup of millet. Harsh words of complaint started to form in his mouth, but then he remembered that his father had almost been whipped the night before because of Ishtar's own actions, and he decided it would be more prudent to hold his nose and gulp the glop. Just as he lifted the cup to his mouth, Kazim's giant hand snatched it from him. "Kazim, that's my breakfast!" he squealed. The bodyguard looked carefully at the cup. "Just as I feared," he said. "This millet is spoiled. It would be deadly to one who eats it." Shaking and with terror in her eyes, Varta took the cup. "How did you know?" Kazim pointed to some bubbles in the millet. Varta shook her head slowly, staring at the cup. "I shall borrow some fresh millet from another file," she said. Servants and Varta and Kazim began rolling up sleeping pads, folding up tents, and packing up cooking gear. "You know," Kazim said to Ishtar, "another pair of hands working would make this go much faster." At first Ishtar was shocked at the suggestion that he help in such menial tasks. But then he looked across the camp and saw that every man and woman was helping in the work, including his father and uncles. And then he remembered how everyone had helped clean up his mess that first day. So with a sigh of resignation, he began rolling and folding and packing, Kazim teaching him along the way. The two bells rang, and the caravan lurched forward. This time Ishtar knew they would not stop until the sun had once again set. As they started up the narrow path into the steep cliffs, Ishtar understood why the caravan could not have climbed them in the dark. He was amazed the animals could even fit on the narrow trail, let alone climb it with a load. "Come, it will be safer for you on your camel," Kazim said. Without waiting for a reply, he lifted Ishtar right up into the saddle. From here, Ishtar could not see the trail beneath the camel's feet, only the cliff's sheer drop to his right. "Kazim, what are you doing?" he shouted, wrinkling his nose at the smell of the camel. "I will surely fall to my death." "The camel will not miss a step on this steep and rocky trail," Kazim said. "I have no such confidence in your own feet. You are much safer up there." Sure enough, shortly after the sun reached the noon hour, Ishtar's camel safely reached the top of the trail and followed the files in front of it out onto the flat. The heat punched Ishtar in the face. He sucked in great breaths and felt like he was suffocating. "Kazim," he called weakly, "I cannot breathe." "Breathe through your nose, little one," Kazim said. Then he pulled out Ishtar's black wool coat and threw it over the boy's head and shoulders. "Are you trying to roast me like a pig?" Ishtar shouted. "The wool blocks the sun the best," Kazim answered, "and the dark color pulls the heat away from your body. It holds in your moisture during the heat of the day and holds in your heat in the cold of the night." Sure enough, though covered in wool, it acted more like a shelter than a blanket, and Ishtar felt much cooler. After several hours of riding, the camel didn't smell as bad either. What is this place? Ishtar asked, looking at an endless flat plain with no trees or grass. This is the high plateau of Zagros. It will take many weeks to cross, and many more to recover from its crossing. A short time later, Ishtar looked around and saw that everyone else in the caravan had also shaded themselves in wool, and that they now climbed onto the backs of camels. Soon there was no one left walking, not even Kazim. Ishtar was so hungry he was actually happy to see the cups of millet being passed around for lunch. As the sun set that evening, they arrived at their first oasis, a small pond surrounded by palm trees. The pond was too salty to drink, but there was a well, and they paid the owners 5 sacks of grain for the right to refill their water bags. A generous amount, Salamar said. For a caravan this size, you should never pay more than 5 sacks of grain for water. It was while they were setting up the tents. Kazim had taught Ishtar how to pound the stakes into the ground, and Ishtar enjoyed that. Ishtar saw a dark figure head into the desert, away from the oasis. He could not see the person, but wondered why anyone would go out into the night alone. Around the campfire a short time later, Salamar called for silence. I have 2 announcements, he said, sitting on top of his camel to be heard. First, there is another caravan approaching from the north and east. They will arrive shortly and camp to the north. We have made contact with them, and they are a friendly group of traders from Chola. Tomorrow you may bargain with them as you wish. Second, he continued, from this point on we must be guided directly by the star. Therefore we shall be traveling only at night. Everyone started talking at once, some excited, some concerned. Ishtar heard some say traveling at night would be much cooler and faster. Others worried they would stumble in the darkness, or fail to see a snake or scorpion in their path. Salamar clapped his hands loudly, and everyone was instantly silent. I know that night travel is both good and bad, but for us it is the only option. We will therefore rest here tonight and all day tomorrow, and continue our journey tomorrow night as soon as a star appears. I suggest, Salamar concluded his speech, that you stay awake as long as possible tonight and sleep tomorrow to prepare yourselves for the weeks ahead. The crowd started to disperse, and Ishtar ran up to Salamar. Father, Father, does this mean I may stay up all night? Salamar smiled. Yes, if you can. But you are still under the care of Kazim, and he will decide when you are to sleep. Ishtar jumped up and down in a cheer. But first, Salamar continued, you, your uncles, and I have been invited to dine with the traders from the other caravan. You will wash and dress in your formal clothes. Ishtar cheered again at the thought of this. He ran back to his own tent with Kazim on his heels. Kazim, I get to put on clean clothes! Ishtar, slow down, Kazim yelled. I shall look like a prince again. Slow down, I said. Ishtar ignored his bodyguard. He ran up to his tent, dropped to his knees, and crawled through the door flap as Kazim yelled, Ishtar, no! Ishtar froze as if every bone and muscle in his body had turned to rock. Only inches away, a pair of green eyes stared him in the face, but they were not human eyes, and as his own eyes adjusted to the light, he saw the gaping mouth, fangs, and spread hood of a king cobra. Ishtar did not blink, but he did utter the slightest bit of a whimper. The cobra was also still, exactly as Ishtar had seen in the many snake charmer shows that had come through Amaranth. He knew the cobra was always most still just before it struck. Then the cobra twitched ever so slightly and lunged toward Ishtar's throat. In that same moment, a powerful hand grabbed Ishtar by the back of the tunic and pulled him into the air as a long, curved sword sliced through the wall of the tent and cut off the head of the snake. Ishtar landed several feet back as Kazim made sure the serpent was dead. Now that the danger was past, he began to scream and scramble away in the dirt. Kazim dropped to his side. "Ishtar, it is over. You are safe." But Ishtar broke down crying and hugged Kazim tightly. "You have had a terrible fright," the bodyguard said, "but all is well." Then he pulled away and looked Ishtar in the eyes. "This is why you must always do as I say. There are many dangers in the desert, and many of them would love to eat you." Ishtar calmed a little and nodded. "I am thankful you were close by." A moment later he added, "Why did my god Bes not protect me?" By the time word came that the other caravan had arrived, Ishtar had recovered from the encounter, had washed in buckets of well water, and had put on his formal clothes. They were more wrinkled than he'd like, but he decided that was to be expected when traveling. Kazim escorted Ishtar to Salamar's tent. "I will leave him in your care. I have some repairs to attend to," Kazim said to Salamar. "Oh, is there trouble I should know about?" Kazim looked at Ishtar and then back at his employer. "No, nothing serious, just some minor cleaning and repairs to Ishtar's tent." Kazim left, and Ishtar was happy to be with his father. As they walked toward the other caravan, he said, "I believe Kazim is a very good bodyguard. Do we pay him enough?" Salamar was confused. "Why, yes, we pay him well. Ishtar, what happened?" But by then they had reached the large, ornate tent of the traders. They removed their sandals and stepped onto thick, soft rugs. The tent was huge, with oil lamps hanging from the poles. A full banquet had already been set, and Ishtar wondered how they managed that in the short time since they'd arrived. Ishtar was introduced to the sheik, whose tent this was, several traders, and some other men whose names he'd never remember. Salamar offered a gift of tea to the sheik, and then they all sat on pillows and began the casual conversation that was strictly regulated by culture and tradition. For every one thing a man might say, the responder had to choose carefully between 8 or 10 possible answers, or risk offending the other. Salamar was carefully negotiating such a conversation with the other men, speaking of politics, families, history, and business. Ishtar wasn't really listening, though, because he kept seeing the cobra staring him in the face and thinking about how it got into his tent. That's why he didn't hear when the conversation turned to religion. Through the mist of his own thoughts, he heard someone say, "But of course there exists only one God." Ishtar let out a loud laugh. "Well, that's ridiculous," he yelled. Every man seated around the dinner sucked in his breath. Salamar stared at his son wide-eyed. The sheik who had made the comment sat with his mouth open, and 5 of the sheik's men jumped to their feet, drew their swords, and pointed them directly at Ishtar and his father. Ishtar is old enough to know better than to ignore the warning yell of an adult, but young enough to forget to obey such a warning. That almost got him killed. That's why adults watch out for children and teach them to obey even when they don't understand why. It's like that with God, too. Some of us are old enough, we've been around God long enough, to know how He wants us to behave. But then we get excited with our own plans or see an attractive opportunity and run off chasing it, leaving God far behind and ignoring His warnings. Giving up control of our lives to God is tough, but submission to God is what brings us true life.